The story of Polycarp is one of the most interesting and fascinating stories about the early years of Christianity. He was, of course, a disciple of John the Apostle, and therefore provides a direct link between the Apostles and the early Christian Church. He was born in the year 69, so that was just 36 years after Jesus was crucified. The Apostle John lived almost to the end of the century, and Polycarp became a disciple and close friend, especially during the last decade or so of John's life. John was actually the last of the apostles to die, and thereafter Polycarp became a man of immense influence in the early Christian church. He actually gave numerous sermons and speeches and wrote many letters. One of his letters to the Philippians survived to this day. In this letter we can see actually many of the battles and trials of the early church. We can also see why he is regarded as such an amazing and influential church father and witness amazing sights from the ancient Roman Empire, which included much of modern-day Turkey at that time. So in the early decades, actually, Christians refused to give worship to the Roman emperor, and this brought them into conflict from time to time with the official authorities. But it wasn't just a conflict with the state. The early church had actually also to define itself as a separate religion from the Jewish religion, and also to battle against false teachings that were beginning to emerge inside the church itself. These false teachings revolved around two basic ideas known as Gnosticism and Marcionism. Both of these ideas actually involve the concept of dualism, or that there is two gods, a greater God who created the spiritual world and a lesser God who created the physical world. Gnostics actually believed that salvation was achieved by acquiring secret knowledge to allow people to escape from the physical world and be reunited in the spiritual world after death. However, this distorted the Gospels in order to promote such ideas, and Polycarp found himself in a battle against such ideas in the early years of the 2nd century. The same theme actually runs through much of Paul's letters, warning Christians about the emergence of false teachings. Both Paul and Polycarp were keenly aware that different ideologies, or as Paul actually called them, a different gospel, could only lead to division and trouble within the church, and therefore needed to be rejected and stamped out. Therefore, as a disciple of John, Polycarp found himself in a unique position. He was regarded as the leader of the Christian community at this stage, and he found himself basically in the forefront of a battle in the early part of the 2nd century. At one point, he actually met the famous Gnostic Marcion. According to Irenaeus, when they met in Rome, Marcion asked Polycarp, "Do you recognize me?" And Polycarp replied, "I do recognize you. I recognize you as the firstborn of Satan." So this sharp response reflected Polycarp's firm stance against atheism at a very early stage, and he saw the dangers in tolerating alternative ideologies, because he recognized that if alternative ideologies were allowed to survive, that would inevitably lead to division and to splinter groups and to disharmony within the church generally. It was part of his unique spiritual genius to recognize this reality at a very early stage in church development. So Marcion actually promoted a particular form of Gnosticism, which was very simplistic and therefore had great appeal in its own way. He believed there should be a complete break with Judaism and the Old Testament. That religion represented the God of the Old Testament, and that was no longer relevant. The God of the Old Testament was a cruel God of rules, and as modern atheists like Richard Dawkins have also pointed out. But according to Marcion, Jesus had revealed a new God, a spiritual God of kindness and love and forgiveness and all of that. And he produced his own version of the first Bible ever compiled to bring all these ideas together. Gnosticism and Marcionism appear to explain in a simplistic way why there was so much suffering in the world created by a bad God, and why the next world would be so much better. Their secret formula would also allow people to escape the trap of the evil physical world and become part of the spiritual world of the good God after death. However, unfortunately, there was one major problem with Gnosticism and its offshoot Marcionism. It contradicted much of what Jesus actually said and thought. That's why it found itself at loggerheads with Polycarp, who was a student of John the Apostle. And that's why he was so blunt with Marcion when he met him in Rome, and he called him the firstborn of Satan, because he recognized him as basically the promoter of a different ideology or a different gospel, something Paul was also completely condemned. Polycarp became Bishop of Smyrna in the early decades of the 2nd century, which is today the modern city of Izmir in Turkey. It's mainly a Muslim city today with a tiny Christian population of less than actually 1%. Here is the main Catholic church, which is called after Polycarp. In the end, Polycarp lived the message he preached. He encouraged Christians to stand for the faith all his life, as can still be seen by his letter to the Philippians. At the end of his life, he refused to give homage or worship to the emperor, and he burned in flames rather than deny the actual message he was taught by the Apostle John. He died as a martyr because he refused to give worship to the Roman emperor, and he was it was a horrific scene in Rome, and many people were converted that witnessed it, and it helped Christianity to grow in the decades ahead. Thank you very much for watching. That's it for today, and I tried to capture in that video, which was only 8 or 10 minutes, 3 or 4 of the pressures that were actually on the church in the first couple of hundred years. One was that there was sort of rival ideologies from Greek philosophy, which in the form of Gnosticism and Marcionism, which was an offshoot of that. Paul wrote in his letters about that as well, about the false gospel that was being preached. And you can see in the actual letter to the Philippians by Polycarp that he was very concerned about the same thing. So, second one was, of course, that the state itself, the Christians wouldn't give worship to the emperor. So therefore, there was a lot of, from time to time, waves of persecution. And eventually, of course, Polycarp himself became a victim of that when he was a very old man. And there's also the pressure of trying to distinguish the new religion from Judaism. And that was another situation that created a lot of stress and problems for the early church fathers. So that's it for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to make other actual videos of a similar nature in the next few weeks. So if you'd like to actually subscribe, you'll have an opportunity to see those. So goodbye for now. Thank you.